Hello, and welcome to Impacto AZ, a podcast dedicated to centering Latinx voices on the important issues of the day. I'm your host, Jonathan Higuera, and today my guest is Mr. David Lopez, one of the preeminent civil rights and employment lawyers in the country. David has spent his career defending and protecting the human and civil rights of countless people. David recently joined the Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law at Arizona State University as a law professor, and previously was a law professor at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey, where he also served as dean of the law school for 3 years. For some of you in the audience, you may know him as the former General Counsel of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, where he served for 6 years, one of the longest tenures in that position of that agency. The cases he and his teams worked on garnered national attention. In addition to being a Harvard Law alum, he also did his undergraduate work at Arizona State University, where he was a MECHA president and co-founder of the Hispanic Convocation Ceremony, established in 1984, and which still is held today. Those are among his many accomplishments. So without further ado, hello, David. How are you?
Hey, John, I'm great. And it's great to be here. And congratulations on your show and your new endeavor. And I'm glad to be one of your guinea pigs.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it. There were so many topics we could get into with you. I mean, your work is it's just a large breadth of work. And but I want to start out with the recent U.S. Supreme Court decision in the case that, as I understand it, basically allows federal agents to profile some people based on their skin color, the language they're speaking, and even their place of employment. The Perdomo versus Nome decision, is it as bad as it sounds, David?
Well, I mean, I think you really hit sort of the top line issues there. And I think it's sort of important to contextualize it to understand that there's still some lawyering to be done. So basically what happened is that this case grew out of the recent workplace raids in Los Angeles by ICE. And as a result of those raids, many people were detained and a lawsuit was brought basically challenging the use by ICE of making detentions based on 4 factors. The factors were the apparent racial appearance, meaning, Latino, brown skin, the language that the person used or accented English, the location where the raid occurred, and the type of job that the person did. And so based on a really voluminous record that was brought by the plaintiffs in this case, the district court stayed those practices and basically said, look, you can't make reasonable suspicion stop based on those general factors. You need to have individualized suspicion. That's what the courts have always said. So this basically went up to the Ninth Circuit, the appellate court. They approved, and then it went to the Supreme Court of the United States on something called the shadow docket. Do you know what the shadow docket is? I probably should explain.
Tell me about the shadow docket.
Yeah. So I think I think that most of us understand. A lot of us have read cases like Brown v. Board of Education. And I think a basic tenet of Supreme Court jurisprudence and of basically our legal system is really the transparency in the reasons for the decision. That way people can say, hey, I agree with this, I don't agree with this. That way Congress can say, I agree with this, I don't agree with this. But over the past few years, the Supreme Court has started to make decisions without providing any reasoning. And that's when a case goes up on what they call the emergency docket. That means usually when the government brings a lawsuit, and the government, petitions the Supreme Court on a case where their actions were stayed. And usually this has happened only with the Trump administration. So this has happened, I think, 12 times already during the Trump administration, where the Trump administration went to the Supreme Court. It's almost like going to daddy, right? It's like go to daddy, say, hey, Supreme Court, we don't like this decision. And the Supreme Court basically, in this case and in most of the other cases, basically reversed the decision without providing any reasons at all, right? And so because they don't provide any reasons at all, everyone's sort of left guessing, hey, why do they do that, right? Is it because they think racial profiling is okay? Is it because there's some procedural issues in the case? So people really don't know why they did this. However, one of the justices, Brett Kavanaugh, wrote what's known as a concurring opinion, basically saying, hey, you want to know why I decided this decision this way? Let me explain it. And so he sort of walked through why he thought those 4 factors were perfectly okay from a constitutional standpoint to do a reasonable suspicion stop. Right.
And is this the only rationale you as a lawyer, others who are against this can kind of piece together how to combat this in the future is by looking at his rationale?
Well, I mean, I think that's pretty telling. But what you have to remember is that based on a really voluminous record, and some of this stuff is actually in the public sphere on YouTube, and we're hoping to be able to tee up one of those videos. That the record included information about U.S. citizens who were stopped by ICE and questioned about their citizenship. One, I think, individual in this case was stopped 4 times, right? Somebody who owned a car wash.
And these stops were not gentle from what I could see. I mean, in some cases, they were handled fairly roughly.
Yeah.
Thrown to the ground or...
Yeah, I mean, that's the rub here. And we can chat about that a little bit later, because Brett Kavanaugh, the way he sort of described the stops is that basically, the ICE agents would go up and say, sir, are you a U.S. citizen? Oh, yes, sir. Here's my documentation. You're free to go. But that completely contradicted the record in this case in terms of individuals who were actually treated fairly aggressively, if not violently. And like I said, one of the individuals, the named plaintiffs in this case, was stopped on 4 different occasions. And so, that's one of the things that I think has really sort of generated a lot of controversy. And I think that it might be useful to sort of talk about Fourth Amendment due process, right? The Fourth Amendment clause of the U.S. Constitution provides due process. And up until, probably about 30, 40 years ago, that basically meant that, in order to arrest somebody, you needed probable cause, right? But what has happened is that that's been relaxed. And it's particularly been relaxed in the immigration context, right? But it's also been relaxed in other contexts where the police are allowed to do brief, reasonable suspicion stops. So the standard isn't probable cause, which is a pretty stringent standard. It's whether you have reasonable suspicion to stop somebody because you believe that they may have engaged in a crime, right? But still, the courts have always said you can't do that based on stereotypes. You have to do that based on individual circumstances. Here, that did not happen. And that's why many scholars and many advocates out of civil society are really super concerned that this could be just a tremendous game changer and that this could basically have green lighted to ICE, but also to all the private citizens out there who sort of self-deputize and look out for, the undocumented. The whole notion that you can look at somebody and based on the way they look or the way they speak, that you can make generalizations about their documentation status. And that's something that is really a game changer. Like, that's something that's new. And as Justice Sotomayor said in the dissent, that in effect creates second-class citizens. That means that people like you, like me, like so many people we know who are U.S. citizens and are Latino, that we're subject to these sort of reasonable detention stops, but also individuals who are here lawfully who may not be citizens. They may have TPS status, they may have DACA status, they may have asylum claims, and sort of the notion that you can look at somebody, right, and determine what their documentation status or determine that they are undocumented individuals is something that I personally, and I'm certainly not alone here, find just incredibly offensive and incredibly dangerous.
Now, is this something that we can do anything about at this point, given that it's a Supreme Court ruling? There's no other place to appeal a Supreme Court ruling, as far as I can tell. What are the options we have as those of us who are very concerned about this to fight
Yeah,
back?
I think there's a couple things. One is it's important to remember, like I said, that this came up on the shadow or emergency docket. That means that this case is still going on, right? So that means the court is going to hear evidence. They're going to have a trial in terms of whether there have been legal violations. This case went up because the district court enjoined ICE from using these factors, right? And basically enjoined means like stopped them, like you can't do that. But still, even though they have the green light to do this, the whole constitutionality of these factors is still going to be potentially litigated in the lower court. And there's a hearing coming up later on this month. We'll see. Like some people are concerned that they're like, hey, you don't need to be a weatherman to know which way the wind is blowing. We know where the Supreme Court is going on this. Why are we even going forward with this suit, right? So that's one thing to think about, right? But I think it's just really super useful through vehicles such as this show for all of us to go out and talk about this, right? And to make sure that there's public awareness about what's going on. And to really, I hate to, frame it this way, but to really say, look, there's a real disconnect in the society between people who are in communities that are now surveilled with the imprimatur of the courts and other people who, like perhaps presumably Brett Kavanaugh, who never in his life has had to worry about being stopped by the police, right? And then it's really important to tell these stories because the sort of notion that these stops are sort of innocent and not stigmatizing and not humiliating for the individual, not humiliating the individual and not stigmatizing the community, I think that within these communities, they land just completely differently. And it's just important that people own their voice and tell these stories.
And didn't even Mr. Kavanaugh acknowledge that if you're treated poorly and you're an American citizen or you have grounds that you can have recourse through filing lawsuits and things like that?
Yeah, yeah. And that's right. That's an important point. But then that caveat has other caveats. So what he basically said is, look, I agree with Justice Sotomayor that if what the plaintiff said in this case happened, that those are potential civil rights violations. Nothing in this decision really keeps them from individually filing civil rights lawsuits, right? But the fact of the matter is that the courts have made it very difficult to sue ICE agents for civil rights violations. And the fact of the matter is that most people don't walk around with a lawyer on speed dial ready to go through, all of the stress and the time consumption with bringing a suit. So most people just sort of let it go, right? And it's important to note that that just wasn't the record of this case. Like the record of this case was that these stops were not these sort of imaginary innocent stops that Kavanaugh talks about, that these were extremely, extremely aggressive stops.
Now, being from Arizona, it seems like deja vu all over again. Who said that? Maybe Yogi Berra. But we've kind of seen this playbook when Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio was running around and who admittedly was profiling people based on his agents could tell, his sheriffs could tell if they were undocumented by looking how they dress and their language. That seemed to be our first run in. I maybe misspoke, not our first run in, but where we saw profiling legitimized. But that was ended, right, by a court decision, right? Or does this decision say what he did would have been okay?
No, again, it goes back to we're not really sure what the other five justices of the Supreme Court were thinking here, right? And so, so I guess you can infer that Brett Kavanaugh would say, hey, maybe that particular judge got it wrong. But remember what happened in Arizona it was really similar. It was sort of the driving while brown. It was a racial profiling that went on. And that case went to a full-blown trial, right? And what happened after that trial is that a judge that was a Republican appointee that many regarded as a very conservative judge, basically found that the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department had engaged in unconstitutional racial profiling of the Latino community. And what he did is he issued not a temporary injunction or a stay, like in this case, he issued a permanent injunction, right? The next chapter, maybe folks in Arizona know, but a lot of people may not know, is that they continue to engage in this unconstitutional conduct. And Sheriff Joe Arpaio was first held in civil contempt, and then he was held in criminal contempt. And then that criminal contempt citation was actually removed by a pardon by Donald Trump as soon as he was elected, came into office in 2017. So it is deja vu all over again, but that's a perfect example of what a full-blown trial might look like, right? There wasn't a preliminary injunction in that case. There was a full trial to determine the constitutionality of the stops. And based on these factors, and I believe in that case, and I have not gone back to it, I actually believe that the sheriff's department had articulated a few more factors that they're like, oh, it's the way the person is dressed or whatever, right? But here there were only 4 factors. And of course, the whole issue of appearance and language often will merge. And then, the sort of idea that, hey, as a statistical matter, undocumented people work at car wash. Like I remember when I was young in Phoenix, I was wanted to work at Weiss Guy's car wash. Remember that one down there in Grand Avenue? It's like, I want to work because of the movie Car Wash, right? But I guess that would have placed me in this sort of like statistical zone, right? Where supposedly, undocumented workers work. And then also by the location where they are. And so that's not only at these work locations, but it also, according to the government's arguments in this case, would be like a place like a bus stop. Mm-hmm. Like so supposedly, statistically, and of course, there was no evidence for this. Like they're just sort of throwing this out. Like the evidence is pretty thin. What Justice Kavanaugh said in many parts, he was talking about, sort of statistical generalizations, but he didn't cite anything. But the whole notion that your car breaks down, you're at a bus stop, and suddenly, like you satisfy one of the factors for a reasonable detention, a reasonable suspicious detention, is really crazy, right? So what you got to understand is like what the court is basically saying is that they have all these generalities. Like generally, you're more likely to find undocumented people working in these jobs in these locations, and generally undocumented people in Los Angeles County are going to be Latino appearing, right? And are going to, speak Spanish or speak with an English accent, right? But I think many of us know who actually get out there in the world, probably more than your average Supreme Court justice, that one, there are many people who are brown skinned and speak with an accent who are documented and have legal status. There are many people who work in low income jobs because that's the only job they can find, who have documentation status. There are many people, and I know this as a professor, right? There are undocumented people that are going to school at every university I've worked at, right? Mm-hmm. And, studying to become a lawyer, and there are undocumented people who are lawyers. And, the whole notion that, you can take these statistical generalizations and use it as an excuse to stop just anybody who fits this profile is something that if the whole Supreme Court signs off on it, I mean, that's a game changer. Like that's really bad for the community.
Maybe now would be a good time to cue up the video that I know you brought along that you wanted us to see. And maybe you can share it and we can see how this played out at least one night in the streets of Los Angeles.
This face-to-face encounter with ICE agents still has Brian Gaviria shaken. That's because he says he's an American citizen.
East Los Angeles, born and raised, man. I'm American. I stated I was American. He still attacked me. We're not safe, guys. We're not safe in America today. Be careful.
Gaviria says he was working at a tow yard on West Olympic Boulevard in Montebello when he heard ICE agents were outside.
I stepped outside. An agent came up to me and approached me, and he started walking towards me. I stated I was American 3 times before he even grabbed me. I said, brother, I'm American. I'm American. I'm American.
He says the agent asked him what city and hospital he was born in.
I said, I don't know. I don't know. And because I didn't know, he threw me to the gate and he twisted my arm. My homie was born here.
During the encounter, he says his friend, also an American citizen, was rough-handled by federal agents.
I see my friend stating that he's an American. He gets slammed to the floor. He's bleeding from his forehead. I want to jump in. I want to defend my friend. ICE agent looks at me, racks around into his AR-15. I can't win that battle, man.
Gaviria says the agent took both his phone and real ID and only let him go because his friend started filming.
Couldn't sleep last night. Let me tell you the truth. He took my ID. He took my phone. He never gave me back my ID. Is this guy going to come and pick me up at 2, 3 in the morning? I don't know.
Gaviria says he won't be silenced about what he calls blatant mistreatment his community faces during these raids.
It doesn't make me happy. I don't want to be in this position. I don't want to have my face out there like this.
That is shocking, alarming, and obviously it terrifies a lot of people. And right now, we're not sure if we have recourse through the courts to do something about that, if that happens to us or any of our family and friends.
Yeah. And of course, when I'm watching that, I'm like, oh, that could be, any of my nephews, right? Any of my third generation nephews. And again, I don't want to elevate, citizenship as the gold standard for, the rights that we have, the right to kind of walk the streets free of harm. But certainly, you and I both know many people who, we know that guy. We know that guy, right?
Right.
Right. And the fact that happened with armed agents, with masked agents, I think is alarming in and of itself. But what Kavanaugh is saying, right, and I think people need to remember this, is that, hey, that guy still might have a civil rights suit. I don't know, right? He might have a civil rights suit to the extent that they used excessive force. Some of the plaintiffs in this case, and I think he was one of them, because I think when he couldn't produce he couldn't identify the hospital where he was born, I think they took him downtown, so to speak, for further questioning, right?
I'm glad I've memorized that.
I know.
Born.
Yeah,
the hospital where I was born.
I have no clue which hospital I was born in. Right, I have no clue which hospital I was born in. And those are intimidating encounters. It's like it's like that.
Oh yeah.
Cheech Chong. It's like the Cheech Marine movie, Born in East LA. Remember that? It's like, who's the president of the United States? And the guy gets really nervous. He goes, that guy, John Wayne, right? Because to be accosted and they have him surrounded, he can't move. They're saying that this is sort of what they call just a brief detention, but that guy can't move. That guy was basically, hemmed in. The minute he started to move, they're like, okay, we got you for assaulting an ICE agent, right?
Right. And I've heard of other stories of people spending time overnight in jail before they were released and were here lawfully.
And of course, racial profiling is something that's gone on in Black and brown communities for a long time, right? When I was in the New York area, there was a whole stop and frisk lawsuit, which is another one like this, where basically the police are like, well, as a general matter, the individuals in this neighborhood are engaged in, firearms offenses or drug offenses. And as a general matter, they tend to be young. And even though they never admitted, here, that they were racial profiling, I think what happened there is that the ACLU demonstrated that they were only picking up Black and brown people, right? And so again, that's another case where the court is like, hey, wait a second, that's unconstitutional. What's different here is that the government went in, your government that your taxes pay for, they went in and said, yeah, one of the factors is racial appearance. That's one of the factors, right?
It seems ludicrous on its face, but I guess we'll have to see where it goes from here.
Yeah, but now it's not good, John. I just want you to know that. Right now, I want your viewers to know that this is a bad omen. I think that, on one hand, with Brett Kavanaugh as my law nerd, okay, at least somebody explains what they're doing on the shadow docket. But then when you see the flimsiness of the analysis, the flimsiness of the rationale, the seeming disconnection with broader communities in the United States of America, it's something that's alarming if those views are shared by 5 of the other justices. They're just alarming. And it basically means that, unless the Supreme Court addresses this head on, and I suspect if this makes it back to the Supreme Court, people are going to attack this head on, right? Because there have been lower court decisions that said, hey, maybe the Supreme Court decisions that kind of indicated race could be a factor, those were wrong, right? Those are wrong as a statistical matter because over 70% of the people that live in Los Angeles County, the Latinos, are U.S. citizens, right?
Right.
And so to draw those generalizations and try to apply it to the community creates, as Justice Sotomayor said, second-class citizenship status.
Okay. Well, with the time we have left, and thank you for that beautiful summary of that and taking us through that case, and it's something we all need to be alarmed and aware of. But I also want to give with our listeners, with the time we have left, a little idea of who you are a little bit more. So I want to ask you a couple of questions, a little bit off this topic, but still relating to your career and your background. And the first question I want to ask is, what led you to get involved in this type of work? By that, I mean, you chose law as a career, and you chose the type of law career that emphasized justice and civil rights. What took you down that path, David?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it'll sort of take us back to. I mean, I think the answer is to where I've ended up at Arizona State University in the background, right? This is how I recall the story: is that at Arizona State University there was a place that many of us, I may have seen you there once or twice, would hang out. Hung yad, as Bad Bunny would say, right in front of the library, and it was called the Chicano Bush. And we would talk about life and love and our families and whatever. But we'd also talk about the issues of the day. And I think at that point, the Latino population at ASU was about 4%. And we would always talk about, whether we had the same paths for opportunity, whether we're always going to be, as I think many of us felt, second-class citizens in our own community. And somebody said, maybe it was even you, John, I don't know. Somebody's like, well, what we need is a Latino Martin Luther King, right? We need that leadership to get us out of there. And of course, I knew a version of the Martin Luther King story, but I didn't know the deep history of the civil rights movement. And so I looked at the course catalog and is there anything on civil rights history or the civil rights movement? There wasn't. But ASU, and I'm always thankful for this, ASU always had that professor that's willing to work with you, right? That's willing to work with me. And so I ended up doing 2 independent studies on the civil rights movement, right, in the South, and just sort of the thousands of unnamed people that put their bodies on the line, that were willing to sacrifice in order to push, both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. John Lewis, who was beaten to an inch of his life on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in order to fight for the right to vote, nearly 100 years, more than 100 years after emancipation, right, in the South. And just those stories were just incredibly powerful and inspiring to me. And they basically, at the point I was at ASU, made me want to go to law school to be a civil rights lawyer. And so when I went back east to Harvard, it was partly to study with a professor named Derek Bell, who was, many know as sort of the founder of the critical race theory movement, but who has always had a really sort of unique, and some would say pessimistic view of the chances at racial progress in this country. And so, with that, I became a civil rights lawyer. I bounced around a little bit. And, when you and I were, young people hanging out in Adams Morgan and Washington, D.C., I was able to work at a law firm that allowed me to have a side hustle working as a civil rights lawyer. And I took that into the Civil Rights Division, into the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And then, with respect to immigration, it was really the realization that immigration law in many respects is labor law, because immigration decides how much bargaining power somebody has, right? In terms of, their susceptibility to exploitation, in terms of their ability to organize with other workers. At the EOC, we were involved in many cases involving vulnerable female workers who were subject to extreme forms of sexual harassment because of their immigration status. There's a great documentary that you can find online called Rape in the Fields, right, that talks about that work. And I think you just realize that these categories that we have, civil rights law, employment law, immigration law, that they actually really blur into each other, right? And so I take that with me to the classroom. I take that with me in terms of how I look at the world. The workers who right now they're saying can be profiled for stops, often you're going to have employers who are going to say, hey, I don't want to get in trouble for hiring an undocumented person. This person is brown. This person has an accent. I'm not going to hire that person, right? You can have the same stereotypes, or you can go into a workplace and you can have that sort of busybody at the next cubicle saying, I don't think you're legal. Are you legal? I think I'm going to call ICE, right? And just have them call like the 1-800 Nome line, said, hey, I think this person is undocumented. And then, the internet is sort of full of all these videos of people accusing other people of not being in the country legally because of some factor or another. And that's the world we live in. And that's the world so many in the Latino community, even if they've been here, their families have been here for multiple generations, that they need to navigate this, navigate this world. And so that was really my inspiration. And so for me, the chance to come all the way back after all these years and after getting this gray hair to come back to Arizona State University, right? And to be able to teach in these subjects and hopefully do some pretty innovative and aggressive programming that talks about labor and immigration and civil rights is just too exciting. To come back home, at this university that obviously is not perfect, but that I love and has really opened the doors for many, and to have the opportunity to create spaces for other students of all backgrounds, to sort of think about these issues in new and innovative ways. That's just super exciting for me.
Well, David,
but I love Rutgers. Just in case any of my Rutgers students, they know it. They know it. They know I love them. They know it's hard. But
I was going to mention that, yes, your move from the East Coast, where you established a marvelous career and a track record, and to bring it all the way back over here. We thank you for that. I know you could have stayed and been comfortable and do trailblazing work where you were at, but you're now choosing to do that here in Arizona as well. So that's a tribute to your loyalty and your heritage. And with that, I think we've hit our time limit. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you again. And we look forward to maybe having you back on our show again to discuss whatever comes up in the future. And
I think, again, thank you for having me. We're at a moment where nobody makes lawyers jokes anymore, because lawyers are doing this great work. And, I think a lot of your listeners are probably aware of the Xiomara Abrego Garcia saga. They may be aware of challenges to the suspension of TPS for Venezuelans, or to, the recent case involving separated Guatemalan workers, Guatemalan children. So there's so much lawyering that's going on that impacts our community. So I'm always excited about the opportunity of talking to people about it, and always here for you, my brother.
I think we got a taste of some of the things you'll be working on here in Arizona, from Arizona at least. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay. Have a good one, and we will connect again soon.
Thanks.
Okay.